Hey friends, this is Marilyn from tarotclarity.com, and today's video falls under the category, it's not what it is, it's what it looks like what it is. You've heard the expression, fake it until you make it, and that's a little bit what this video is about. If you may notice, today I'm wearing clothes. I took a shower and I have on some earrings. And I had to force myself to do these things because I know that I don't do anybody any good if I don't have a voice. Now, coincidentally, I thought today would be a nice day to do a video, and I apologize if my voice is low. I'm very weak, and you may have to tune up your volume. In case you can't hear me very well. But today would have been Pamela Colman Smith's birthday, February 16th. Now, for those of you who have watched me and whenever I've done tributes to Pamela Colman Smith, I never call her Pixie. I never refer to her as Pixie because I was not in her inner circle. I was not one of her friends, you know. I would like to believe that if we had the opportunity to meet, we would be friendly, but I didn't know her personally, and so I cannot bring myself to call her Pixie, but I can call her by her given name, Pamela Colman Smith. Now, we all know Pamela Colman Smith created, I guess, what we would consider the quintessential modern day tarot deck. Most people, when they learn tarot, especially, I guess, in the UK and in the United States, learn or noticed tarot for the first time. Her deck, you know, it was the deck that was most ordinary to us. That wasn't the case with me. I learned about tarot from watching Dark Shadows, and the first time a tarot deck appeared on national American television, it was on the Dark Shadows show, and they used for the first time the 1JJ Swiss. I was a 10-year-old little girl, and I saw those cards, and I was already on a artistic trajectory, and I saw those cards and I was like, whoa, what is this magic? You know, they were beautiful, I thought. And I just never forgot what they looked like. And then when I became older as a teenager, in fact, this year, I'm sure it's this year. I was never really sure if it was 75 or 76. But in a moment of clarity, I realized it was the year I turned 17, and I turned 17 in the summer of 75. So this year marks my 50th anniversary reading and interpreting tarot cards. But getting back to the story, in 1975, I went to the shopping mall, and my objective was to purchase some music, some albums, you know, because that's what teenagers did. I probably had birthday money, and I was just, you know, before I went to the music store, I went into this, I think it was called either Spencer's or Steyn's gift shop, which was a novelty shop kind of place. And what did I spot? I knew it as soon as I saw it. A deck of 1JJ Swiss tarot cards. So I purchased it and I forgot all about the album. I never bought an album that day. However, I want to come full circle to the fact that most people didn't go that route. And even Dark Shadows, in the years after that, when they used tarot cards, they used the Pamela Colman Smith, Rider-Waite Smith deck, because it was by then introduced to the United States. Neither deck, I don't think, had been really in the United States prior to that. But in the 70s, I think the Rider-Waite Smith deck became available in the United States. And so then it just kind of took over. And then when Dark Shadows did programs using tarot, they used the Rider-Waite Smith from that point on. So I thought, since Pamela Colman Smith's deck was the deck of the everyday person, from 1909 or 10 on, I thought it might be fun to compare it to the everyday deck that was first created. Or we don't know if it was the first everyday deck that was created, but I thought it would be fun to compare it to the Rosenwald tarot deck, which is one of the earliest decks produced for the mass consumer public. Now, I'm going to remove the pip cards from all these decks because I just want to look at the Triumph cards. And I'm going to be using three decks for this. I'm going to use two Rosenwald decks. I'm going to be using the recent one that I purchased from Marco Benedetti, which is the Rivoltini deck, where the backs are folded onto the front. And then I'm also going to be using the Rosenwald by Artisan Tarot, because theirs is the line drawings, and I'm going to be using a production of the 1910 crackle back rather than the 1909 lily back, only because I think the lily backs, I like the lily backs better, to be honest, but I think the lily back production, the color wasn't quite what Pamela Colman Smith or Arthur Edward Waite preferred. And so I think the 1910 may have been a little closer to their expectation. So I don't know if either of them ever saw the Rosenwald deck. In fact, it's unlikely. It's unlikely. We know that they were both exposed to the Solabuska, right? But I just want to see, let's see, what could the word be? Just by fate, or just by coincidence? What similarities may have occurred between the two decks? So let me go off camera because I have to put some of these decks in order. It may take a while because my head is not in a clear spot. And I want to apologize in advance for any verbal faux pas I say. Please give me the benefit of the doubt. I'm heavily drugged up on all kinds of medicines to make me cough less, and etc., etc. Okay, so I want to identify the decks I'm using. I've decided to use the Triumph deck of the Rosenwald cards, published by Artisan Tarot, and specifically by Kristen Condor, who created the deck by taking the original images and carving into a wood block each of the images that would have appeared that did appear on the sheet, and then hand printing it as it would have been done originally. All the decks were missing the full card, so it's unknown if the Rosenwald did not have a full card, or if they decided to combine features of the Fool with the Magician card. So that is unknown. So anyone who has since attempted to create a Rosenwald deck has had to place a Fool in it to make it a complete deck. And so this would explain why Marco's deck and this deck by Artisan would have different Fools. There will be differences in the Wheel of Fortune also, because parts of the Wheel of Fortune were not clear. Okay, so since this is Pamela Colman Smith's birthday, I'd like to present the image that she put forth. Now bear in mind that she also would have been putting forth a black and white drawing, and it would have been up to Arthur Edward Waite to add color. As I said, I think, if I didn't, I'm saying it now, in the 1909 Lilybacks, the color that was applied didn't meet it with his satisfaction, and so he republished the deck in 1910, gave it different backs and different color. This particular deck that I'm using is available on Make Playing Cards through the account of a gentleman named Conrad Steyn. So you can look there if you'd like to see or get a copy of this deck, which, as far as I know, is one of the truest that you can get in reproducing the 1910 deck. There are limitations, and no reproduction is ever going to be exact. The middle deck, as I mentioned, is the Marco Benedetti Rosenwald. This particular one is the one that shows the folding over. Now, I did say in my last video that I was going to do a reading with the deck as my next video, but I guess that'll have to come later. So here we have the Fool. Now, since we don't know what the original Fool of the Rosenwald would have looked like if there had been one, Pamela Colman Smith, even had she known what the Rosenwald was, she may not have ever had any familiarity with the Rosenwald. She created hers from probably reference material, probably as the TDM or the Tarot of Marseille style as being her most significant style, excuse me, and also using Sola Brusca as a reference point. But I love how in the early tarot decks, and both of these artists created their Fool card in keeping with other known Fool cards that did exist early. Okay, the Fool card did exist in other decks, and so in keeping with that tradition, they made the Fool like a vagabond or someone who was really down on their luck or maybe late in the head. And it's interesting to see that Pamela Colman Smith did not do that. She elevated the Fool to, kind of like a, I would say, spoiled child of wealth who had everything and maybe took it for granted and doesn't recognize his own folly or her own folly. She does incorporate the dog, which we don't see in either of these decks, but the dog was included in other Fool cards, so, of the early days. So there is a tradition for the dog. Now, as I mentioned, the magician of the Rosenwald could have been combination of the Fool and the Magician. But here we clearly see, he's not out of doors. We can't specify that he's out of doors in this older deck. But he is a guy who was a con man, a trickster, go through town, tricking people, a sleight of hand tricks, right? And he would be run out of town when the people caught on to him, or when he just, there was nothing left for him. Kind of like, who is that guy in The Music Man? The music professor who went from town to town conning people, kind of a guy like that. But again, with the Rider-Waite Smith deck, we see a different agenda altogether, an elevation of the lowest ranking card to one of a higher rank, even though it's only still number one. But bear in mind, the Triumph order originally was intended it was a trick-taking game. So the higher your number, the more value the individual card had in taking the trick. So it would have been represented by the lowest common denominator of an individual, somebody who wasn't seen in high regard in the community. But by the time the Order of the Golden Dawn came, they disregarded that concept and gave the lowest ranking card a high elevation and replaced the tricks of the con with the symbols of the suits. And I think this was done, I can't recall who was the first to do it. I've done a video on it. It was probably somebody like Eliphas Levi or somebody like that, but I can't speak right now on that authority, so I'm not positive. The female pope in this period of time was probably a reference to Pope Joan. Now, bear in mind that when Kristen Condor did her deck, she left in the original order of the cards. One of the things about this original sheet of the Rosenwald is that there may have definitely been a problem with the numbers, which is why it was rejected and put in a bookbinding. And Marco has disregarded the numbers so that we can put the cards in our preferred numbering system, which is what I've done. The only exception for me is I put the World card as the penultimate, and then I put the Judgment card as the end, because that is the order of triumph that I prefer. But here the female pope has different attributes. The Empress. Oh, and also the Rosenwald appears in two different orientations because it was printed one way, and perhaps incorrectly, as I mentioned, with the numbers being incorrect, and maybe the way it faced was not accurate. I think Marco's deck makes the adjustment for removing the incorrect numbers and then also putting the images in the direction that was probably intended. So there's not a whole lot of difference we see in the Rider-Waite Smith deck, we see a woman surrounded by opulence, growth, right? All kinds of, a suggestion of fertility. I don't know that we get that here. But here I think, and I appreciate that we have a woman of power in her own right. She's a woman of power, not dependent on her femininity, as we see here. Okay, I messed up with the Emperor. Let me find him. Okie doke. When I was putting the decks in order, I mistook the Emperor, for a king. But very simply, in matching the previous card, which was the Empress, just a man of power, of secular power. Now here we have attributes of war power. He's armored, right? He's definitely a man of the world. We see him in an outdoor setting. But he's not just a man of secular power or global power. They are able to simply signify his global awareness or power with the globe. But there's something of a war, like a conqueror about that guy, right? Okay, the Pope. We have the triple tier. Like the female Pope, there's a key, which may or may not have appeared. I think it did, but may or may not have appeared. That might have been one of the vague features on the original sheet. Not too dissimilar now, is it? And it's interesting that Marco chose red and white. Originally, of course, the drawing would have just been in black and white here, and it would have been up to the Cartiers, I guess, to add the color. We don't see the acolytes in this card either. That we see in later decks of the Pope. But we get a sense in all three that there's a higher order, that he's got the key. Now, I don't think there's a key here. Oh, yeah, there's the keys there. The Lover card as a symbol of union, a bond. Even if it was a bad marriage, it was a bond that had to be taken very seriously because it was in every family's best interest, that kind of thing. Although since this was a deck for the everyday person, maybe it represented just love between two people. And here we're reminded of vice and virtue with the snake. We don't see another woman who could represent virtue or vice. I'm presuming this young lady, I don't know which one she represents. In these cards, I get a sense of the heart wants what the heart wants. But here, I get a sense of maybe the heart wants what it wants, but be careful what you want. Now you see quite differently that the chariot had a 10. Marco removed it, and by the time tarot comes down to us, the chariot is more commonly represented as a 7. I do apologize. Please just forgive all my coughing. And I'm taking a cough suppressant, so this thing, it's like my second week in bed. It's nasty. Definitely nasty. At any rate, we don't see a canopy in the representation here. We just see the chariot. We see perhaps a victor. He's got a globe. He's a warrior. He's been knighted. Maybe he's a prince. Or maybe not knighted, but he's got a crown. And he's got 2 horses facing in, looking like he's about to make a turn. But in order to maintain the Egyptian agenda that the occultists had around the turn of the century. There's a return to the thought of an Egyptian theme. So rather than horses, we have the Sphinx and a canopied chariot. Now we have a difference in numbering because the occultists decided that fortitude belonged in the 8th position. But I will compare it with the other justice cards. With this justice, I'll take their justice card and compare it with the other justice cards for number 8. And justice is represented as a virtue, and we see that in the halo, which was the style in Florence, which wasn't very far from Perugia, which is where the deck was published, probably published. It was found in a publishing house in Perugia, recall as a bookbinding, as part of the bookbinding. So here, I don't know that we see it as a virtue here, but we see it as a very stately concept. And here we have, now in keeping with the older Italian decks, the Hermit card, if he had anything in his hand besides a cane or a crutch, it would have been like an hourglass to show that time passes. Think of like old man time, making room for the new year, something like that. Just like the old leaving the scene, making it available for the new, right? But by the time of TDM, in my thoughts, the hourglass became misunderstood, or I think it's because of the Metelli star card, and I've done many videos on that. Remember where you heard it first, folks. I've said it a billion times, but at any rate, at some point, I think the tradition of the hermit became confused with the Metelli star card, the hermit, and took on the attributes of Diogenes with the lantern looking for an honest man. It's not a terrible understanding of the hermit card. Clearly, it's what the Order of the Golden Dawn believed. And he's not a frail, decrepit old guy telling that it's the end of the road of something. He's someone who's trying to enlighten. He's reached the point of enlightenment, and he's trying to shed light below, or in the context of a question. He does have his walking stick, however, but maybe it's more like a time stick for telling time in the dirt. And then we have the Wheel of Fortune, which, along with the World card, is typically my least favorite card in a tarot deck because I just think they're ugly. But of course, Rider-Waite Smith added the Torah tarot kind of motif along with the Egyptian stuff. And we have the concept of I reign, I have reigned, I will reign, and then I have no reign. It's interesting because the way these decks were printed, the Wheel of Fortune turns in a different direction, right? Here it seems, if we're to look at this figure, is giving it a a suggestion that it's turning in this direction. But we don't have the 4. We don't have it here. We don't have, I have rained, I have no rain, I'm about to rain perhaps, and I'm coming down from a rain. We don't really have that 4, but they give us the 4 evangelist stuff in the corners. And we don't see that in the earlier Italian decks. Fortitude, if we recall, was number 8 in the Waite Smith canon. Now, there are some Italian decks that have Hercules clubbing a lion to tame it into submission, but often we have a woman with a column, which could be a reference to, a Bible story, perhaps Hercules. We see an awful lot of the lemniscate in the Rider-Waite Smith deck with we saw it in the above the hat of the magician. And I think it's their effort to tie the number 8 card with order, with the justice card really is, properly, I think, number 8, because justice is a lack of chaos. Justice is order. But by making strength that rather than justice, I think they had to justify order in some way. And so they put the lemniscate over the head of the number 8 card that they chose to show order, I guess. But I'm probably speaking out of turn there. Not too much difference. He's awake. We do have reference probably to Judas Iscariot with his money, betraying Christ, but he's awake. And even if this isn't representing Judas Iscariot, there's a suggestion that this punishment was a crime for either theft or taking something in exchange for money. Here, he's not. We don't see that. He's enlightened, maybe sacrificial, maybe a reference to the sacrifice of Christ. But think of the origins of the hanged one. He wasn't. This wasn't a symbol for sacrificing for the benefit of mankind. They were being punished for a crime they committed. This was the punishment. So there's quite a different message here. You see, he's enlightened. Now, it's possible by the time somebody's punished in this way, they might be enlightened in the sense that they say, oh my goodness, I did a stupid thing. I'm paying the price. But I would think that might be the extent of their enlightenment. But I also think it's interesting that in a lot of these earlier decks, because, if they're featuring Northern Italians, they were blondes, so the blonde hair, I have often wondered this, if the blonde hair somehow became the halo, the idea for a halo. Death on a horse. Body parts below. Interestingly, Marco chose to do it in the same direction. Now, 14 would not have been temperance, as we see. It was labeled 7, but I've put it as the 14th card. Now, I see temperance as a card that shows lessening the toxic effects of something by diluting it. these in the wrong order. I'm sorry. Okay, we have the devil. You know, he's kind of a comical looking devil. The Rosenwald from the late 14 or 1500, early 1500s. But by here we get a more scary representation of the devil and being a slave to our vices. And it's not a bad representation. I always see the devil coming before the tower as, you know, vanity comes before the fall. I've also come to the conclusion, and it's taken me a while, but thinking that probably the celestial event of the sky was more significant than the building itself. So the thunder and lightning is probably what, if you recall, with tarot, the card represented a concept, and the artist could portray the concept in the way they saw fit. So in a town that had towers, lightning the concept of lightning could very easily have been represented by lightning striking a tower. Because we see in some cards, lightning, we see in the Metelli from the mid-1600s, an Italian deck, lightning hitting a person. And then we see in some like cards from Brussels that lightning is hitting a tree. So it stands to reason that lightning striking was more the concept. Now, what does lightning strike? Well, when lightning strikes, it's very humbling. You know, it eliminates what was worked for. The Tower of Babel might have been a good example for why the tower might have been chosen in the first place to represent a lightning strike, right? Because it follows the concept of vanity comes before the fall. When Nebuchadnezzar, got too big for his britches, trying to create a tower that could reach the heavens. He was humbled. When the tower was struck, I don't know that the tower was struck. I don't know that there's any biblical reference to the tower being struck by lightning per se, but it was crumbled. And here we just see a simple reference to the star, the concept of the star, and this you can see concept of the moon. But at some point, the concept of the star became associated with the constellation of Aquarius, and I've shown many times in my videos my thought on how that happened, because I did many rabbit hole digs, and I wanted to know, what was it about the constellation of Aquarius that would superimpose itself on the concept of the star? And when the constellation of Aquarius popped up, which is a constellation of stars, obviously, it was a signal for opportunity of hope, because that's when the waters would come. That's when the rain would come. And that's when one could irrigate the land. And so the concept of the star, right, which frequently, represented hope. We saw the Star of Bethlehem as the hope, guiding, taking us to the Christ child, for example, right? So this concept of hope became encapsulated, I believe, in what was represented in the constellation of Aquarius. That's just my 2 cents. I never read that in any book regarding tarot at all. So that's just my own personal thought. Here again, just the concept of the moon. And at some point, the moon became synonymous with the image of 2 dogs, a crayfish, and 2 towers. And I did a rabbit hole on that, and I've shared it many times in my videos. But I wanted to know why. Where did this come from? Now, it could have just been representing a place that everybody knew, maybe, as a place to go eat lobster at Joe's, who knows? And go enjoy the moonlight night because they have a great view. It could have been something as simple as that. But when I did my rabbit hole dig, I wanted to know why this image. And, when the crayfish comes out to feed at night, which is what we have here. But the dogs are, this is their prey. So they're going to thwart the efforts of this crayfish to nourish itself. So in the context of this image, the nighttime card or the moon card doesn't just represent things that the moon affects, right? Maybe nighttime, but it also shows a depiction of how things could happen behind the scenes to thwart an individual's growth. Okay, we have the sun, just the simple sunny sun. We all know we feel good after a dark and gloomy evening. If we have a night of insomnia and the demons get in our heads and we have all these thoughts, in the morning time when the sun comes, things always seem much nicer and better. Now, I know I have these in the order that is not standard, but this is the order I prefer. I really strongly dislike, as I mentioned, this representation or similar representations in the TDM of the World card. I like the suggestion that this is what we accomplish on this earth. This is what we accomplish. The goal is to attain, attain your place in the world. And here we have the representation of probably an affluent town. It's got towers. But what happens after? What happens after we've attained whatever it is we attain in this world? We're called to account for our actions, and that's why I like this card last. We're called to account for what we did. So some of the Rider-Waite Smith cards really do seem to lend themselves to the history of what these cards may have represented, but others adapted, the agenda of the occultists to throw in, Egyptian motifs when they could. I also want to mention that the concept or the idea of borders on all the cards that we see today, I'm convinced, is a reflection of the tradition. The reason we have borders on cards from today is the tradition of having folded the backs onto the fronts and creating a border, whether it was decorative like the back or plain like the back. Okay? This would have been a border because the backs were plain. This became the border because the backs were decorative. If you look close, you can see that this is definitely a rivoltini. And here, the border wasn't created in that way. If it were, we'd have the crackle back edge. But because there's no tradition of the cards having, bleeding to the edge, they're always contained by a border, because the border was created by the Rivaldini fold. Anyway, I hope this video has been interesting. Let me flip. I hope this video has been interesting, and I hope it's been a nod to Pamela Colman Smith. I like to do something about her every February 16th. And until next time, friends, peace, stay well, be kind, stay tuned. Tomorrow is supposed to be a big day in the grassroots effort of the United States. I hope it makes news overseas, and I hope enough people are able to participate